we're going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Appreciate all the great input that the folks joining gave us on some questions freehand. We've tried to incorporate some of those in. If other questions come up or there's an aspect of a question that you want to talk further about, we will have a portion at the end of the panel discussion to answer those. There is a Q&A function in Zoom. So if you could put your questions in there, I can use that to come back to you at the end if we need further clarity, or I can hand those over to somebody to answer from the panel here. And that would allow us to get through the topics that we want to hit on that we feel are important, but also get some feedback from the team and the audience. We will answer all the questions through a type up at the end and send that out to the list and a video. So for those of you that for some reason want to come back and watch some of us chat again about these topics, I'll be available, or if you've got colleagues, we'll make that available. And we do have a poll here that I'm gonna close right now. But before we get started, let me introduce the panel. My name is FORREST Churchill here with CANUSA EPC. Work with some of you in the industry, and some of you have not met, but appreciate you taking some time. We have assembled 3 purviews from the used equipment market. We've got Brad Gentry joining us from an operator's perspective. Brad's been working with a lot of client operators in the US and some that were cross-border into Canada. He's an expert in the DOT and PHMSA compliance sector for pipelines and some operations. He's was at Meritage that transitioned through a sale, and now he's found himself as the midstream operations vice president for SPRUCE operating. Brad's out of the Denver market. Helping us on the equipment side, we've got MIKEY, MAHONEY, and LYLE Landry from ARC Energy. They are responsible for supplying used equipment as well as new equipment, and they work with a lot of used equipment opportunities. MIKEY's the VP of ARC, one of the principals there. MIKEY, if you want to, where are you located out of?
I'm out of Houston, Texas.
There you go. And LYLE works with MIKEY's team on when a project comes in, helping with the facility execution of that. LYLE, are you out of Houston as well?
I'm actually out of Scott, Louisiana.
Okay. So ARC's got a footprint. They're international as well. So great perspective from them. And then we've also got Ted ZEIGER joining us. Ted's one of my colleagues here at CANUSA EPC. He has worked with various used equipment applications for clients' needs. And, you know, typically Ted is helping clients get through aggressive schedules and moving through some of the minutia that comes up in those. So Ted, appreciate you coming on and giving us a perspective from the consultant's point of view when we're working with used equipment in these projects. We're gonna just looking at the polls here. Looks like we've got from the questions answered, where are people from? Well, we've got about a majority, a little bit over half from the US. We've got our Canadian colleagues joining around 33%, and then we've got North America, so some people that are jet setters. So pretty good coverage there from the different markets that we've all played in or served. And then from people that have dealt with used equipment, it looks like a 50-50 split here, panel. So some people that maybe just they hear used equipment, they think about used cars, and that's not their jam. And then we've got some folks that are probably got some war stories just like you'll talk about. And then so we'll get some good color from that. Appreciate the feedback from the audience there. Moving on, we have a good icebreaker question for the panel that I want to start with. Everyone's going to give a little quick answer here. And this one came from an audience member in registration. What type of equipment would you prefer to source rather than go down a used evaluation? Is there just something that in your experience you won't touch? And we'll start with, let's start with Brad out of the gate in that one.
Yeah, sounds good for us. You know, from my side, I've deployed a lot of used equipment on the end user side. So I think we put in just about everything, but, you know, kind of look at the severe service exchanger side of the world, you know, just getting into that stuff I've seen some issues on that side. And then, you know, I haven't deployed a lot of used cold boxes, but that could be another area just around any type of concern around thermal fatigue and so forth. But I would say the exchanger side takes a little bit careful thought and inspection and due diligence around those type of equipment.
Great. Yeah, I know the brazed aluminum market, right? Long lead times. So you could see people being interested in maybe getting their hands on some used ones there. But they are thin walled, and I know that operating profile can greatly affect that fatigue. So good feedback there. Mikey and Lyle, you guys want to throw something that from the ARC side, which you think is just really challenging to recondition?
I think Brad nailed it on the head. I think those items you really have to pay attention to, and you have to put in a lot of procedures from the inspection side and testing side if you are going to reuse them. Those are very critical, and so that's where we would have our most concern and do the most testing and due diligence before reutilizing them. So I think Brad nailed it.
Yeah, and you're operating in such a tight frame on design conditions for exchangers. Oftentimes, it's not even worth us trying to retrofit into a new process. So things like shell and tubes or plate and frames like you'll see on lean rich exchangers are often things that we won't try to recondition. That'll be something that we'll source new.
Great. Ted, you want to round it out with some what to
Sure.
watch out?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest obstacle I've found in the reconditioned market is if you have a piece of equipment that you just don't have good documentation on. So we ran into a couple of situations where we didn't have either UNAs or other pressure vessel certifications, and it almost isn't worth trying to track down. Going back to original manufacturers often isn't an option, as well as trying to go back to the National Board of Registration, trying to get paperwork. It's just such a headache. And frankly, going back to your analogy of used cars, imagine trying to buy a car with no title. It really is a major roadblock.
Yeah. Unless you're in Vermont, I think there was a loophole to get like people were registering cars in Vermont that were stolen. So there's a little way, but on the used equipment side, I think that's a good purview to have that, and we're going to talk about documentation, Ted, and the team has a passion there, I know. Talking to the market, what we're seeing, there is a lot of interest in the dehydration and amine space, reusing those. We're seeing clients obviously move dehydration units around for gathering systems and plants. And they're pretty standard in what's there expectation wise. So you can see how they'd be easy to say, hey, a dehy unit doing this kind of dew point control and throughput, I can just put it over here in this service, especially if clients have them in their yard. And so we wanted to focus a little bit around the dehy and amine unit reconditioned equipment first. And so one of the first questions we had come up was around mechanical integrity units in those, throwing this at ARC to start with. What are some of the areas of the amine or the dehydration units that you would initially look at mechanical integrity indication for, a valuable path forward on the reconditioning?
Yeah, so I would say major equipment would be the pump main solution pumps, the larger pumps. You definitely want to look at them, even whenever we've reutilized the new surplus unit. We've had pumps that have gone bad, and so we normally put a contingency in to replace at least one of them, and then the rest of the smaller pumps we generally buy new. All the valves, critical valves, we run through all the valves. We actually send them in and either recondition them or get reconditioned ones or new ones to suffice them based on timelines and effectiveness within the schedule and the budget. The hot oil unit or the regen system is a major one. Looking at that thoroughly is huge, just from way people operated before and what type of service it was in. And because you have to hone those in, and those can go long-term. Lyle, you can probably add some more there as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Mikey. And existing vessels, obviously you want to do a full survey, thickness checks, flange surface checks, internal visual inspections, basically looking for low areas and any kind of surface cracking or anything like that. That's another big area. But Mikey pretty much hit it on the head. You want to make sure that you're reconditioning control valves, safety valves. Those are the big areas.
All right, I appreciate that. I know you can get some heat stable salts forming and how they run those amine units, and it can definitely have some kind of brittleness factor on burners and everything in that reboiler. So I know that's a critical spot. Brad or Ted, you got anything you want to add color on first places you'd look at an amine unit to see if it's worth it?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Yeah, definitely on the regeneration system. Any of the area that's exposed to the acid gas is going to be subject to high levels of corrosion. Exchangers, going back to the comments about pumps, you know, it's definitely on the reflux pumps. It's not really worth. We're trying to refurbish something small like that, fractional horsepower pumps, that sort of thing. A lot of this stuff comes out of a yard. It's been in storage. No one's really turning the pumps over, so you can have bad seals, dead spots in the bearings. So it really does need to be gone through on the larger pumps.
All right, Brad, any comment there?
Yeah, I think the group hit the nail on the head. I would say, you know, obviously, if you said you had a carbon steel post weld heat treat on the rich side, you know, starting kind of what to Ted's point of the contactor, right? Coming into the contactor, you know, there's been different designs over the years with where that inlet gas distributor and how it hits the sidewalls and where the, you know, the corrosion can happen. And, you know, that's really key. Obviously, big tower and can be costly. And then even, you know, kind of working down from that point around that level control valve that goes into your flash tank. You know, I've seen over time that kind of area with that pressure cut and the service, the erosion that happens within that assembly. But I think the group hit the nail on the head on the rest of the spots.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
would
so-
just I'd add one more thing. We normally look at the longest lead item. Now, you know, long lead items change over time. We probably were facing something 10 years ago that we're not facing now, but really looking at long lead items and what's there. I know Brad had brought up the contactor. You know, we didn't even talk. I was talking about the regen, but the gas train. Obviously, those things. A contactor can be a long lead time. Your MCC, your control system, is it there? Do you have it? Because what's the point of going recon if you don't have the lead time to get it in? Because that's what generally people are using it for. So that's just another thing I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, it's not just mechanical integrity. There's the supporting utilities around that package if they're there or they need to be, you know, sourced or included in the scope of the project. One of the other things too that we've heard is, you know, looking at how people ran equipment really tells you what you're getting into. So there's some key points in an amine unit that the team thinks are important. Maybe throwing this at Brad or Ted to start with, since you've been on the operating side. Brad, like that, you know, what's a key thing from operations you think is important for the health of that unit?
Yeah, you know, it kind of goes back to my statement. You know, I've seen in past where, you know, it happened recently in the Rocky Mountain region, a big gas processing company lost their contactor, you know, and so you look at those areas of corrosion concerns that can really, you know, eat away at that wall thickness on the system, and that's a huge risk, you know. And you know, as we get later in this, people doing their inspections, and as Mikey said, you know, it's critical. And you know, when you lose a contactor, that can be serious.
Ted, you good, or saw you chirping?
I'm just trying to, you know, marry the original operating conditions to the relocated operating conditions, pressures and temperatures. In the case of amine, you know, looking at the gas composition, and it can be difficult to make that match from an old to a new location. So while there is flexibility in a lot of this equipment, it's certainly not one size fits all. So you have to be a little bit selective when trying to relocate a piece of equipment, such as an amine or a DHI.
Yeah, and you know, amines and DHIs are big, right? There's contactors, regens, pumps, exchangers, a lot of parts, right? So those are pretty complex overall systems. And so I think definitely not one size fits all there. So appreciate the insight there. And you know, when we talk about, you know, Mike, you hit on it. A lot of people are looking at used equipment from a schedule perspective, but they're usually, hey, maybe they go into it thinking of cost, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about cost approach for reconditioned equipment. Is there a guidance that you can provide with used equipment on helping people compare it to new equipment? You know, if we think lead time is there, you know, they're going to start focusing on cost next, right? And so how do you help clients that come to you and say, hey, I got this piece of equipment, or you're selling one? How do you help them differentiate the cost between that and used?
You want me to go?
Yeah, someone for, yeah,
Okay.
Ark, I think, can take a crack at this, since you guys probably see both sides of it pretty regularly.
So this is a difficult one because ARC, you know, as we buy used equipment, sometimes we have to relay some pretty bad news to the people that have originally put it in, because when you go buy it, you're not getting back your engineering, your construction cost, all your project management, any of that stuff generally, or you balance the plan. A lot of it does, and almost no gas train matches up. And you're very lucky if the gas train matches up with the aiming plant for the new location. So the value is just not there when you're buying them. For the person purchasing it, that's where you come in, and sometimes it's very hard to explain, because when somebody comes in to purchase it, it's not a regen generally, you know, it's a regen, a gas train, you know, your balance of plant items, your MCC, your transformers, your thermal oxidizer. And so a lot of people have a price in their mind because they go out and they'll get a regen number for that package, but not have all the balance of plant and the timing that goes associated with that. So generally, you know, on a schedule perspective, you generally can do about, we've done up to half or better on timing from a schedule from new to recon, even better than that. And you do about 75% to 85% of what a new cost is. Now, that's not turnkey, that's equipment only. Your other costs are generally about the same. You might actually have a higher project management cost on recon because you're squeezing it all in, all the equipment's there. You're not building it over time where you have shops using project managers for each one. You have a lot of people coming in. You have a lot of components where you're moving stuff from a location, removing it, bringing it to another location to do, you know, the testing and things like that. So there's a lot of costs in that. And that's why that value is even harder on the front end and relaying it to the end user what it's going to be. So schedule is, in my opinion, the big push for reutilizing those things, more than even the money on it.
Yeah, I think that's some good insight that, you know, when we look at what has to go into securing the equipment, moving it, demobbing, those are all things that you might not have with new equipment, right? And so apples to apples is sometimes hard to do when you're trying to compare it there. So yeah, schedule definitely is got to be a leading factor on used equipment. Otherwise, just go buy the new stuff, right? And one of the questions that came up was around operational life. Like, can a used piece of equipment get to the same operational life as a new one? Do you have clients asking that, or what happens in that space?
More so overseas. You have, you know, in certain areas in the Middle East, you have a 10-year life that they'll do 15, 20. And that's because if you go look up what is carbon steel good for, it says 20 to 30 years. You know, we find steel on the ground that's 100 years old, but it's about how was it maintained? Where did your steel come from? You know, what service was it in? And so we look at all those factors, and being that ARC's done it for a long time, we put in different testing procedures for the length and the service it's been in, the documents and maintenance that have been done to it. I mean, another thing I talk about on the pricing where you can save a lot of money the next customer is if engineering was done before and that person can put that plant down the same exact way. I know you have to relook at the engineering, but it was done and you can do it fairly quickly and save a lot of money, whereas the person selling it generally doesn't get that money back. But that's always something to look at when you're buying them is, hey, what's available and deliverables from the plan I'm buying to where I'm going? Can I reuse that? Can I put it in the same way? And you generally can save a good bit of money and time doing it that way as well.
Okay. Any Brad or Ted, do you guys have any thoughts on that? We can move on to documentation on costs of equipment.
Yeah. To Mikey's point, I actually was pulled into a project because I was on the original deployment of the equipment. I did the engineering on that, and then out of the blue, I got a call from a third party who was buying the equipment, and they were relocating the equipment, and they're asking for some help. And we were able to get them some original documentation. So they tried to build the plant as close to the original installation as possible to save cost, and actually removing a lot of the piping, which normally might not be cost effective to do. And that was kind of a fun project. It never goes together quite the same the second time, but it was pretty close.
I would agree with that.
What are some of the strategies the project team should employ when they're looking at the documentation around the equipment, right? So there's the cost, but then there's bringing that piece of equipment in the project and operations. You know, Brad, what's some of the things you like to see outside of just a picture of something sitting in the field with grass growing around it?
Well, yeah, usually that's the first thing you get.
Yeah.
But no, you know, I always kind of like to start from you know, a big level, high up level from like PSM, or let's just say somebody's gonna come in at this facility one day where you're deploying it. That, I hate to use the term, if something were going to happen, what would they ask for? So when we first go through this process and see, you know, pictures after the picture phase, you know, requesting U1As, as Ted talked about earlier. Sometimes you don't have those U1As, so you're looking for national board numbers, going back to national board, try to get that. I always ask for nameplates of all pictures of all the nameplates out there, because you might be getting a drawing set. You don't know if there's been controls around that drawing set, say management of change. You don't know if they've been updating that. So there might be something else installed there. And even from the vessel side, I've seen where, you know, we didn't know there was a R stamp on the vessel, and there's been modifications to it. So things like that, mechanical drawings, any code calculations that you could get, because that's going to go with the asset, you know. And in nowadays environment, you know, especially stateside, a lot of especially big operators are taking PSM down to their field facilities to a degree, elements of PSM. So this will all get stored in it. And then, you know, I look at your hydro tests, NDT, PSV testing packets. You know, you really need to ensure whether it's going to be done at the shop again. You know, that's all put together, because those could be gotchas if something failed on this piece of equipment. You know, that these are things people are going to be asking for. And then finally, this is usually a hit or miss. You know, any integrity or maintenance documentation has the other operator or whoever's selling this, do they have anything that they've documented, you know? And some of this, you know, I just look, you know, on, especially as it hits the shop or stuff, you know, just line up inspection from an end user perspective. I believe in it. You know, have somebody, these firms out there, you can get CWIs, AI type individuals to go out and assess the equipment, because as you alluded to, once, you know, you'll learn stuff about the documentation as you get through it. It's a condensed schedule. So.
Right. Maybe what are some of the big things after purchasing a piece of equipment you guys have fallen into that affect cost, right? So I think you hit on a little bit about some of the testing and inspection, trying to avoid going to the field and not having that done beforehand. But is there any other traps that you guys have fallen into after receiving used equipment, or Mikey from the org side, that you guys have had to help people with once they've gotten their hands on it that they weren't thinking? Like, what's the big costs you think that come in?
I'll put that one to Lyle, just because he deals with it day to day. So that's his Advil usage.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, some of the things that you just can't quite see in the shop, you know, some of these things like Mikey had mentioned earlier, hot oil systems, fired equipment. You know, there's so much that you can do in the shop, but actually firing that thing up, you know, shake some cobwebs loose once you're actually in operation.
Yeah, Brad, I think you know, having some extra fire tubes, right? I think you've been in that situation where you got some weird custom fire tubes, and now you're like trying to source, you know, something that's not working, and that's where like you're losing schedule and money at that.
Oh yeah, you know, like probably hit a chord here with some, but I always say first and foremost is the condition of the equipment package. I've had stuff land on site that you get some nice surprises, either caked on tubes or within, control users throughout. Also, something as simple as drawing details of, some of these packages that you acquire, that their legacy drawings, and as you could test on the engineering side, there's drawings have evolved over time, and we've got around bad call out details around the internals that we got the surprise at the very end. And then even pulling it from the site, we've had some remediation type surprises that somebody want us to remediate the site, and as an end user on somebody else's, you don't want to take that. You haven't done an environmental assessment where there's a lot of equipment. I'm sure guys in the South with norm, you get norm on the vessels, and so just little things there that can chase you.
Great. I think that, the cost, there is a risk, right? I think everyone's saying there's a risk with used equipment, right? There's a risk. There's no silver bullet here, right? To get a better schedule and less risk and better cost, right? Like everyone wants that. You usually got to pick two of the three. I do want to be conscious of our time. So if people are having some questions come in, I saw one come in, we'll try to get to those. The two other topics we're going to hit on real quick is PSM considerations. Just talk a little bit about, we've hit on it, maybe Brad and Ted, if you want to maybe talk a little bit about the rega gap, some of the things you've talked about UNAs. Is there anything else that clients should be asking about, thinking about used equipment coming into an operating facility that's important that you want to highlight on the PSM considerations? And then we'll try to ask if anyone has any experience with shipping stuff to Canada, because I know we got a lot of stuff coming down from Canada right now, but it has been a scenario where we've shipped stuff up to Canada as well. So Brad, anything on PSM you want to add?
Yeah, so I would start, especially with process packages. Think of process safety information. That's one of the most big time critical element of PSM. So that goes back to what we were saying: drawings, UNAs, any details around that equipment. But also, like we were saying, usually you're in a condensed timeline because you're in the aftermarket, so you're probably chasing schedule. So your engineering evaluations, if it's a package, you got to make sure you get your PSV sizing calcs, all that cause and effect, HAZOPs, somebody's going to be asking, or some form of process hazard analysis, HAZOP being a form, getting that, operating procedures, big element of PSM, and then jump into your mechanical integrity. You have a chance to, if it's going into a brownfield site, of working in potentially API 510, which is your pressure vessel inspections, and 570, which is your piping. So those are all kind of some of the critical areas.
Ted, do you want to add anything there that you've had to help with once?
Yeah, I think Brad mentioned PSVs. That to me, that's pretty critical, because our service conditions, our operating conditions are going to be changing, and in the new location, we just want to make sure that there's not additional sources of overpressure that were maybe not applicable in the original installation, or if there's something in particular about the package equipment getting relocated to the new site that opens up a new opportunity for an upset. So control valves and shutdown valves and PSVs, all that needs to be considered, and absolutely conducting a hazard analysis as part of the installation.
Great. The team for Mark, have you guys had any experience with shipping things up to Canada? I know do you want to talk about maybe just some of the things that people should be aware about trying to take used equipment up into another country, right? Let alone another state or jurisdiction.
So we've done 20 countries. Canada, actually, we've never gone that way. We bought stuff from Canada, so I can explain there. Y'all have been pretty good about your own code there, and so we don't see as much come this way. Go that way as it comes this way, because y'all's code kind of interlaps with ours. I think more people are willing to take equipment from Canada. So we have used it. The only downside is you better catch it at the right time of the year. Because if you, for instance, large aiming contactor we bought from Canada, it ended up taking like 4 times as long because of the weather and the roads and the cost of the permits and whatnot. So I would say that's a challenge, but every place in the world has its own unique challenges, for sure. When it comes to shipping, our staff at ARC it wasn't large enough in the beginning when we started doing international, because there's just so much more paperwork, commercial work, and things like that. But no, for Canada, that's been our experience. Not hasn't shipped much there, but bought a lot coming here.
Yeah, I would say the Canadian market and the U.S. market use the same ASME codes, so a lot of things are built to that. There is registration that has to happen in Canada for the piping, and so you typically it's a lot harder to take that used equipment up, and that's probably why you see that hesitation to do that. There are firms though that maybe when they're fabricating are thinking about this moving across the border because of the operator, and so that there may be some opportunities there. We got about 12 minutes left on time. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. The last thing we're going to talk about is project schedules. We talked about cost, talked about safety and documentation. Project schedule, obviously a lot of people are looking at used equipment to try to accelerate schedule, or they're in a pinch, right? They need to figure something out. What are the, going to Ted and Brad on, having a full view of building a facility, what are some of the things that are like key points in a schedule that you think are critical if you're using a used piece of equipment? Is there any key milestones in a typical execution schedule that should be maybe not considered the same critical path once you induce that used equipment in there?
Yeah,
I would say that we just have to make sure we're allowing a duration in the schedule for the inspection, and in the case of certain equipment where they have to break it down and relocate it from an existing installation, building that into the schedule can really add some time. And then if there's any repairs and modifications that have to be made, we need to make sure that we're taking that into consideration.
Okay, Brad, you got any?
Yeah, I agree with Ted. Really, when I look at the used equipment, let's just say kind of bigger scope items like packages, you have a tighter timeline on engineering evaluations, right? If you're going to new, you're shopping out a data package or something out to RFP out to companies. When you're getting something as is, you have to get through and do your evaluations on a tight timeline. So it's kind of, you got to, focus big, work small, right? To the things that have lead time that could kill you, doing your ratings, capacities, that, hey, do you think you have the full BTU rating of this, type of heater or something? And so it just puts, I think, a lot more, you're constrained on schedule, because that's why you're going for the used equipment, likely that, or, like you had maybe as an end user, a failure of something. So you have to do your assessments pretty quick away from the standard, I would say, engineering evaluation process that goes with, a new greenfield type design.
Yeah, I would echo that. Ted and I have been on some projects where the demob definitely was, tight schedule and just happened, right? And you go there and you're like, oh, the thing's been moved. You're like, well, we didn't think about tagging, right? We didn't have time to tag where everything was. Now we got a bone pile full of valves that we got to figure out where they go back in the line. The other thing too is I think there's some give and take that you'll probably see, right? When you use used equipment, like tagging, right? If you're in a big operator's project where they want an ERP system where everything is tagged for their ERP system, if they're going to re-tag a facility or a piece of equipment, that means you might have to update a lot of drawings, update panels, update that might be a give and take, right? That you might not have in the schedule anymore, or it starts to induce a lot more risk. So I think there is some give and take there that you got to think about when we're talking about where do you think used equipment works? Is there an approach that you have to used equipment? And we can end this with the whole team here chirping in, and then we can have some questions. Where has used equipment worked really well, right, on project schedule? Big projects where you can compartmentalize that equipment, Or are we talking, hey, simple, it's not, it's a heat exchanger or a vessel, right? Like you're gonna pipe to it anyways, so it doesn't really matter if it's used or new. What's some things that you think are good spots for used equipment in the project? We'll start with the ARC team first there.
Yeah, I would say so. The really like we were discussing, we do a great evaluation with the customer, potential customer beforehand to get through the critical path items. Also by running the simulation to what their gas stream is, and then getting with some of the OEMs, the chemical vendors, the tray vendors, to ensure that our run matches up with what they're doing, and ensuring we don't have any bottlenecks in the towers, the major components, any of your exchangers, things like that, where you have to upsize those on the gas train or inside the system. So those are things we look at ahead of time, so that by the time we get to the project, there's an action plan in place. Even at ARC, every day we buy equipment from a filter all the way up to amine plants, cryo plants. It's bringing it in and making sure when you bring it in, you inventory it right, you get the relevant paperwork in advance, you know what needs to be done to the vessel, what's good, what's bad, major things. And so if you're prepared, you're a lot quicker and you shut down a lot of that time. So it is effective, and you don't run into that, hey, we're the same length as new, right? But when you're going into it, you're looking at, hey, what's long lead out there? Well, transformer, well, a contactor, well, brazed aluminum exchangers, things like that. Hey, that's the things I'm going to go check on first and get ready, because if my project has to go in this amount of time and I can buy these things within that time frame new, then I still can get it done. And so that ARC does that because we're guaranteeing the client in that time frame that we give.
Yeah, for facilities, I would say also it's unique in that with recondition, you're allowed to almost run a parallel path in terms of your process review, your simulations, things like that, while you're also doing your integrity testing, your checks on your different vessels and valves, breaking stuff down, sending stuff out to shops to start working on. That allows that schedule compress, along with obvious things like lead times on steel and parts like that as well.
Brad, you want to?
Yeah. Yeah, speaking from the end user standpoint, what we've seen, we've chased everything, but kind of smaller vessels, you're kind of getting into the same, there's a lot of aggressive timelines out there, new versus used. I think Mikey hit the nail on the head. When you start thinking of like cryo components where these long lead items can really go out there, I know there's been a pretty big run, including from our side, previous operator on compression, right? We've seen compression components really go out there. Those are units that you hope operators over time have gone through their, maintenance over time, their top ends and, full overhauls and so forth. But from end user point, it's really around those long lead component that we've really seen when we chase the little stuff, that's usually because of just like, hey, a new opportunity presented itself. But a lot of times, a fuel gas scrubber can get fabricated new pretty quick. Just what people are keeping head wise and plate wise in their shops.
Ed, anything that's when someone asks you to help with the project, you think it's a secret sauce to go call up used equipment?
What I really like and about like ARC's got a lot of their inventory online, and some of the other used resellers have a inventory online. If I spend a couple hours combing through what they have, if I'm just looking for a three-phase separator, man, that a couple hours searching their inventory, I could find something that looks good and give them a call. That's going to save a lot of time.
Yeah, definitely having that data, right? And I think what you have available, the more you have, the quicker people can say, yeah, this is hitting the mark, and then they can give you a call. So I think that's a good feedback there. Well, I got through most of our scheduled questions. We've had one come in. I had a couple that came in with the registration. So Wes, thanks for submitting. I think I've got your question here. I'll phrase it probably to Brad here, because it's got a little bit of operation. But What would you recommend, Brad, when you're procuring critical spares for equipment that maybe that you're purchasing used and maybe it's just not manufactured? Like, does that, how does that affect your approach to saying this is a good piece of used equipment to consider in the project, and possibly what do you do when you need a critical spare that just maybe is 30 years old and the company's not in service anymore?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. That's the things that you're going to have to work through. There would be sometimes on our side where we honestly phase that out, right? Knowing that, if you can't have somebody that could reliably work on it, that the parts are dated, it's tough from an end user to keep going with that equipment item. Now, that's not always the case, but really, it would be, if you did go with it, a critical spare with a contingency plan if there was modifications required to get in what would be the new model of that, because that's what's happened to a lot of operators. You just service to getting spare parts. If you don't have something, that definitely has to weigh in. Do you replace the component, or if you go with it, have a plan that if you do have the critical spare on, that's a different model. Obviously you would probably done a management change or something to get you there, but yeah, that one's a operator risk level on that. Typically we would probably phase that out.
Okay. We had a question about refurbished valves. I think we'll kick this one to our team. Like, what do you guys see in the market right now for refurbished valves? I know obviously getting out of COVID, supply chains catching back up, different things, like you said, ebb and flow. Refurbished valves got a good run on them right now, some value there, or you guys haven't, what are you seeing?
On the smaller valves, a lot of stuff's on the shelf. When you get to the bigger control valves, your larger orbit valves, things like that, you still have some constraints, depending on the project schedule. Again, I mean, ARC doesn't, even when we build a package, we don't just use recondition just to use recondition. We look at the schedule and we do new where it makes sense and use recondition where it makes sense. Or if something is not up to snuff on inspection, then we replace it with new. So, I hope that answers the question. That's what I'd have to say.
Yeah.
More there as well.
And I used to work at Emerson. I always remember, right? The refurb market was the bane of the Fisher, we could paint a valve green and call it Fisher, right? And I think the other thing you'd ask about the soft parts, right? I think there's a lot of aftermarket soft part providers. So when you look at a reconditioned valve, you want to understand how that fits into the rest of your operations around it, right? So there's definitely value there, though, right? Like, those valves are designed to work for 50 years, right? And you just keep them going. So definitely there's value there, and it sounds like the market's will be priced accordingly to the supply that's there, and if you got some unique ones.
Yeah, and there's some great vendors out there. We use them all the time. I know people that use them all the time. So that reman them, the Fishers and things like that. So great groups.
Yeah. Ted, talking about tanks, is there anything, minimum value threshold? This came in. What is the minimum value threshold you place on tanks where you consider to use them? And I think maybe that's minimum value threshold I don't know if that's talking about price, but maybe you have
yeah, I think let's talk about specifically API tanks. There's probably a minimum size there, maybe 400 barrels or greater.
Okay.
And on that sort of equipment, you're kind of talking $15,000 value. When you start having a double handle equipment, that is, demob it, truck it, reinstall it, the cost of handling and refurbishment starts to exceed the value of new, right? So if there's a schedule constraint where you really want to make sure you have that equipment available, then I'd say it's worth it. But when you're talking about equipment's value, where it's, put a number on it, let's say maybe $25,000, you really want to consider why you're using used equipment in those cases, because just the handling cost, the administrative overhead, the engineering involved, that starts to really add up compared to the value of the equipment.
Anyone else want to add some comments there? I think that will be our last question. We've got one other one to throw at the team, but ESG initiatives. You see anyone saying, hey, reusing equipment? Remember when I was in school, reuse, recycle, reduce, right? That was the, that's how we were going to save the planet. Do you see any operators or on the reconditioning side, do you see any clients pushing outside of just schedule and cost?
Yeah, I mean, we've been asked, and ARC does keep it a track of what type of carbon footprint versus new using recon that they saved on the project. I don't know where they're being used for their side to, based on what their project entails. But yeah, there is things brought up. I mean, you've heard of the green steel, blue steel, circular steel. And, ARC has been doing recondition before ESG even came up, just fell into our lap, but it is a great point to make because a lot of people are asking about it, and it is a way to save a carbon footprint as well.
I mean, it goes without saying that steel is probably the number one, or is the number one recycled material, right? You can use steel over and over again. And so even if equipment is reaching end of life, there is still value in it to send it to be recycled. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycling is kind of the last choice, right? Ideally, we've already spent the energy to build equipment, and to reuse it would be the first choice, but not excluding recycling at the end of life.
Any closing comments? I think we got through all the questions, which we were worried about as a panel, but you guys did a great job. Appreciate that. Thank the audience for spending time with us. We will make the recording available and get some of the written high-level caps out for the team. With that, you'll get the contact information from the ARC team here, as well as Ted and Brad. You can find on LinkedIn if you want to talk to him. And he's great to help people, and he's got a wealth of knowledge, but he's getting back into it. So we're excited for Brad. Any feedback too, we're looking to do more of these on different topics. So we appreciate the initial interest, and we're looking forward to continuing that with other hot topics in the industry. So thank you, Brad, Ted, Lyle, and Mikey, for working through this and making yourself available.
Yeah, I would just say thank you, Forrest, for putting this together with these guys. It's great to meet you all, and really enjoyed doing this. So hopefully we help some people out, and anything more granular, please give us an email, and I think that we'll dig in, because I know it was some high level, answers.
Yep.
Yeah, I would echo the same, thanks for letting me participate with all you great individuals, and, those listening, feel free, to reach out. Always trying to advocate for the industry and, help people out. We're better as than I, as the industry, and really just whatever challenges you might be facing. I know somebody across this industry and even across this panel has probably faced it before. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Right. Well, thanks so much. We'll end that, and appreciate everyone's time. Thanks again.